Okay, folks, so this screencast is designed to kind of bridge the gap between the end of the French and Indian War, and some of the things that we've been talking about towards the end of the French and Indian War, and the period we call the road to the revolution. The the people, the instances, and the disagreements that will precipitate the beginning of the rebellion in 1775 and the revolution in 1776. So let's jump into it. An odd person to start with, but I feel like he's prescient in this era. And this is an Irish member of Parliament who served in the English Parliament, a man by the name of Sir Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is considered the father of modern conservatism. You probably have seen something from him before if you studied the French Revolution last year. The most eloquent damnations of the French Revolution and the excesses of the French Revolution. The person who finally speaks up against the déringolade of the excesses of the revolution is this English parliamentarian, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is the guy who coins the phrase that defines this era. So one of the things that we're going to see during this period is the English return to a legal, strict interpretation of the laws or rules of mercantilism. Mercantilism was that economic system designed to enrich the mother country at the expense of her colonies, meaning that in order for England to compete with France, and in order for England to compete with the Netherlands, it had to have exclusive economic relationships with its own colonies. England had to create a system where it could trade with Virginia, that it could get Virginia's tobacco and South Carolina's rice and New England's timber and New England's cod and Pennsylvania's rum, and then turn around and sell its finished goods in the markets of Philadelphia and Savannah and New York. And it had to be able to exclude all of those other European countries from those markets. Well, that's how mercantilism is supposed to work. But Burke rejects that. And contemporary economists will also reject that. You know, here we are in 1765, but we're only a few years away from Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. So we'll talk about more about modern capitalism when we get to Adam Smith. But at any rate, Burke rejects this idea of mercantilism and says that, you know, England makes its money via trade. We ought to let the colonies alone, let them tax themselves, and continue this economic relationship that's benefited everybody. And the phrase that he comes up with is one that I'll ask you to know: salutary neglect. Heretofore, the colonies have been governed with a wise, benign, salutary neglect. We've left them alone, and we made money, and they made money. So why mess with a good thing? And the answer to that question is because we're going to mess with a good thing. So we've already discussed some of the tensions between the colonies and the mother country. One of the things that is going to bring this period to a head is the mounting British war debt from the 7 Years' War. Someone is going to have to pay that. And it's not only the expense from the war, but it's the continued expense from maintaining an army, a colonial garrison in the British colonies. By 1765, the annual expense of maintaining that garrison had ballooned to something like £350,000 sterling a year. So these were two large amounts. And you might be asking, well, England is the wealthiest country in the world in 1763. Why can't they pay it themselves? That's a good question coming from an American. What a British person would say is that, yes, they were the wealthiest country in the world, but English people were also some of the highest taxed people in the world. Your average wealthy English landowner was taxed to the hilt. Compare that to your average wealthy American landowner. your George Washingtons of the world. Well, that person was lowly, wasn't taxed hardly at all. Sure, they paid local taxes, but America didn't need to foot the bill of paying for a large army or a large navy. We depended on the English military for that. So from their perspective, we were getting off easy. Another thing that the English inherited when they won this war is millions of acres of territory under which French people now live, in which Native Americans now live. And they have to figure out how to deal with those two groups who weren't part of the British Empire before this moment. And so their rather inelegant solution to this problem is the Proclamation of 1763, made by His Majesty's government, which gives us the Proclamation line of 1763. And I've identified it here for you. So generally speaking, running north to south, it follows the Appalachian Mountains. And this created a settler-free zone to the west. And the idea here is white people, European settlers, aren't going to move across the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains will serve as a barrier. And on the other side, Native American nations can, grow and flourish on their own. And if we keep the white people on one side of the line and the natives on the other side of the line, then there ought to be peace. This is their way of dealing with and being preemptive about keeping new rebellions like Pontiac's Rebellion from occurring again. And Pontiac's Rebellion was so bad, this rebellion of the Ottawa and Iroquois, that just about every settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains was destroyed in some manner of speaking. Every British fort west of the Appalachians was destroyed, with the exception of Fort Detroit, which will later become Detroit, Michigan, and Fort Duquesne, which is now Fort Pitt. So that was their take on why the Proclamation line of 1763 was valuable or important. From our perspective, those Indian incursions, those rebellions by the Ottawa or the rebellions by the Iroquois, were always temporary. Remember, we've been here since 1607, 1608, and we've never lost a war to the Native Americans. And we've never needed British help to fight Native Americans. So you have two different perspectives on the issue of Native American uprisings and how to maintain peace between these two groups. So enter a new prime minister. And William Pitt the Elder, who is now retired and has been giving the hereditary peerage. He's now a member of the House of Lords, so he's now Lord Chatham. He has been replaced with a new prime minister, Sir George Grenville. And Grenville is going to try to solve the problems that we just mentioned. How to pay down this debt and how to maintain this army in the colonies without breaking the bank. What he'll do is he'll return to a group of laws that have been on the books for 130 plus years. The Navigation Acts were designed to exclude the Dutch. They were designed to exclude the Netherlands from commerce in the 13 British colonies. Some of these Navigation Acts, I have 1650. Some of them were on the books as early as the 1630s. But nobody was paying attention to them. People in the 13 colonies would trade with the Dutch. They would trade with French and Dutch and Swedish possessions in places like South America and the Caribbean and Canada, etc. And everybody kind of winked and looked the other way. Grenville's plan is we're going to start making money through customs duties, and our merchants will be favored because we're going to enforce the Navigation Acts. So that's That's one of the things that he will do. Another thing that he will do is get Parliament to pass the Sugar Act. Sugar Act is important because it was the first revenue-raising device in the colonies. So it's the first time that they pass a law designed to raise tax revenue. And most of you were thinking, aha, that's probably important because we know that it is a tax dispute in some fashion, which will lead to the ultimate dispute. So yes, Sugar Act, first revenue-raising tax in the colonies. 1765, we have the passage of the Quartering Act. When you write this down, the way I remember it, so obviously the Sugar Act concerned sugar and molasses, which was a commodity. Quartering Act, put a little star, underline the word quarters, and you'll never forget what it is. When you quarter somebody, you're giving them room and board. Soldiers are quartered. So the Quartering Act said that colonies had to provide for room and board for the soldiers who were living there. You know, a colony might have to get together. New Jersey or New York might have to get together and start building barracks for soldiers out of the public expense. And they might have to provide so many candles a month and so many pounds of horse fodder and have so many, bottles of rum and so many bottles of wine for the officers and so much, bacon and flour. Quartering Act. Where everything really starts to turn is with the 1765 passage of the Stamp Act. Why were Americans, British colonists living in America, so opposed to the idea of being taxed? Some people think it's because Americans hate taxes, period. And I suppose that's true on some level. But if we dial down into the argument, it was never against the idea of taxes or taxation. Americans were used to paying taxes. They had been paying taxes since they got here. Local taxes to local governments for things like road repair and the militia and public buildings and courthouses and judges, etc. But the argument that James Otis will make, I'd write that down somewhere, Otis, is that taxation without representation is tyranny. This is an old English idea, okay, going back to the 13th century in the Magna Carta. It is lawful to tax a people. It is unlawful and unconstitutional to tax a people unless their representatives have had some say in that taxation. Meaning, I can pay taxes, but I better be able to send representatives to the body which pass those taxes. Otherwise, it is an illegal and unconstitutional tax. And that's been part of English law going back to, as I said, the 13th century, going back to the Magna Carta. There is an element, of course, of irony anytime we talk about individual freedom and liberty from this generation. And it was not lost on the contemporaries of the time. Samuel Johnson, who was a poet and a member of Parliament, asks this question. The people that are yelling about taxation without representation and their fundamental English liberties are the same people in Virginia. We're talking about the Patrick Henrys of the world. We're talking about the Thomas Jeffersons of the world, are also the people who have slaves. And isn't there some element of irony to that? And here is their answer. So, of course, the English would agree. Any tax that is levied without the consent of representative government would be a tyrannical tax. So if the king had decided on his own, if George III, who's all of 24 years old at this point, if George III had turned around and said, yeah, I'm going to levy a tax against the colonies, everyone in England would have also agreed that it was unconstitutional. But the British argument would be this. Every man woman, and child in America is represented in Parliament, in the same way that every man, woman, and child in England is represented in Parliament, through a theory they concoct called virtual representation. We know that I have a list of some contemporary English parliamentary districts here. This is no longer the way it looks, but you can see that certain districts send representatives to Parliament. Over the years, these parliamentary districts change. Some of them grow in population, some of them shrink in population. Same thing with states in America. So you know that every 10 years in America, we have something called a census. We're in the middle of one right now. And why the census is so important is we have to figure out how many Americans live in every state, because the number of Americans who live in each state is the thing that determines the number of congressional representatives each state gets. So right now, New Jersey has 12. But 10 years ago, New Jersey had 13. And 30 years ago, New Jersey had 14. And so after every census, we rebalance. California might go from 54 to 56. New Jersey might go from 12 to 11. Well, in England, they didn't do the rebalancing every 10 years. The rebalancing has to be done via parliamentary legislation. And sometimes that was slow in coming. So there were entire towns in England where there was a representative in Parliament, but there wasn't more than one or two voters. These were called rotten districts or muddy boroughs. And there were places in England, because of the Industrial Revolution, where tens of thousands of people moved but did not have parliamentary representation. Not to mention, women can't vote, children can't vote. So the British would turn around and say, just like people in Manchester and Leeds are underrepresented, so too is Virginia and New York possibly underrepresented. But it doesn't matter, because we have this parliament made up of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and every single member of Parliament, in addition to voting for the needs of their own district, is supposed to, in theory, represent the needs of every single Englishman everywhere, and that includes Virginia and Pennsylvania. Have I convinced you? Is that a good argument? Well, of course it didn't convince most Americans. So the British passed the Stamp Act. Let me go back to the Stamp Act for just a second. We'll explain what it is. Here we go. Nope, one more. There it is. So let's go back to the Stamp Act for just a second. So Stamp Act is important because here's the note that I would take here, is that it's a direct tax collected by Americans from their fellow Americans. And any piece of printed material or any legal document was required to have this stamp affixed to it. So things like playing cards, marriage licenses, legal notices, wills, newspapers were all required to have this low-cost stamp. It will raise, in the end, very little money. But it will, what it will do is it convinces people from all 13 colonies to join together in opposition to British policy. And, you could not have designed an act of parliament more guaranteed to unite the worst possible people to come together if you're England. Think about the kinds of people who would be disproportionately hurt by the Stamp Act. You've got gamblers, you've got newspaper writers, media personnel, people who write op-ed pieces for their newspapers. You've got printers, people like Benjamin Franklin. You've got lawyers, people like Thomas Jefferson. You've got lawyers like John Adams. You've got people who write pamphlets, people like Sam Adams. You've got merchants, people like John Hancock. If all these names sound familiar, it's because, we're going to see them again in opposition not only to the Stamp Act, but in opposition to the next group of parliamentary acts. So Stamp Act was poorly designed, poorly executed, and didn't raise very much money. So, in resistance to the Stamp Act, people in these colonies start talking about a unified response. Rather than just one group or one colony protesting the Stamp Act, why don't we all get together and let Parliament know that we're upset about this? So a general Stamp Act Congress is called. And it's not really successful. 9 out of the 13 colonies are 9 out of the 13 British colonies are represented. Believe it or not, they actually get representation from Canada as well. And 6 of those colonies agree to send a letter to King George III asking His Majesty, as his loyal American subjects, to reconsider the Stamp Act. Maybe, due respect, with all due respect, please let this thing go away. And some really interesting characters that pop up at the Stamp Act Congress that we're going to see again. People like Caesar Rodney from Delaware. Delaware's important? No, not really, but Caesar Rodney is important. Sam Adams from Massachusetts, Brewer, Patriot. Livingston from New York. I bet we'll see him again. But it's not just the Stamp Act Congress who sends a petition to George III. It's also the non-official resistance to British policy. So you get things like the Committees of Correspondence. Committees of Correspondence are just groups of people who write letters back and forth to people from other colonies, so everybody can be on the same page with regard to their resistance movements. One of the leaders is Ben Franklin, and he looks at the way that mail is sent from one part of the continent to another part, and he makes improvements so that a letter can go from one part of the country to another part of the country. You can send a letter from Virginia to Massachusetts, and it only takes a few weeks. Whereas before this, you were looking at 6 weeks or 7 weeks. Something else they do is they agree to non-importation. Essentially, it's a boycott. We will not buy this stuff until you do away with the Stamp Act. If Britain's goal is to raise revenue, we will hurt them where it hurts, in the revenue. You also have the formation of groups dedicated to talking to each other and making sure that everybody is aware of what's going on. Sons of Liberty, Daughters of Liberty. The other thing that these groups do, many of them call themselves the Sons of Liberty. There's Sons of Liberty chapters in Boston. There's Sons of Liberty chapters in Philly. The other thing they do is they enforce the non-importation agreements. And the way that the non-importation agreements are enforced is through violence. So they'll go to a store, tell the store owner that he really ought to consider selling British goods, and then come back the next day, and if the store owner is still selling British goods, they might beat him up, or they might smash the stuff, or they might burn down the store. They might go to the local stamp collector, a guy who were generally called stamp men, and tell them that they need to rethink their occupation. And if they don't get a new job and stop selling stamps, that something bad will happen to them. And a lot of those stamps men get attacked publicly. A lot of their houses are burned down. Some of their houses are torn down in places like South Carolina. Ben Franklin is over in London at this point. He's representing a couple of the colonies at the court of St. James. He's like an unofficial ambassador. And a rumor gets started in Philly by one of these Sons of Liberty groups that he is in favor of the Stamp Act. Now, that wasn't true. It was just a rumor, fake news. But people get so upset about it. And these Sons of Liberty groups are exercising so much unlawful power that a group of them go to Ben Franklin's house in Philly. You can actually see part of it. It's still there with torches, and they're going to burn it down. And poor Deborah Franklin, Ben Franklin's wife, he cheats on her all the time. He really treated her very poorly. But she's a tough lady. She's a tough cookie. So she kicks open the door, and she's got a shotgun, and she points it at the Sons of Liberty who are going to burn down her house. And she convinces them to go somewhere else. So she saves his house. But you can see how upset people are about the Stamp Act. Well, if we're going to engage in non-importation, this economic boycott of British stuff, we better be able to replace it with something. You know, it's easy to say, I'm not going to buy textiles anymore. But you have to wear something on your back. You can't go around, without clothes. So anytime you do a boycott, you have to have a replacement activity. Hey, I don't want you guys to buy McDonald's hamburgers anymore because, I don't like McDonald's. So go to Burger King instead. I don't want you guys to go to Popeyes to eat chicken anymore because Popeyes chicken is awful. So I want you to go to Chick-fil-A all the time. You better have something that people can use instead. So one of the things that we see here is the development of homespun industry. Americans will start making their own clothes rather than buy clothes from England. And it becomes fashionable to wear local stuff. Fashionable to wear a homespun suit rather than, fine imported British textiles. So here's an example of, a woman spinning wheel, turning, wool into thread, which she then will use to make clothing. And a couple of examples of violence used against stamp men. This was a cartoon actually published in London, and attempting to make fun of the Sons of Liberty here. You have the Liberty Tree in the background and a noose. So what we see here is generally called a lynching. Lynching is a extra legal punishment for an imagined offense. So they grab this guy off the street and they beat him up and they smear his body with hot tar, which causes second and third degree burns. If enough of the tar covers your body, you will lose the top couple layers of skin. The skin will slide right off and you will die of infection. You will die of septicemia. It's a terrible, terrible way to die. So being tarred and feathered and then presumably hanged. Here we have a photograph I have of a modern day tarring and feathering in, I believe this was Northern Ireland. This guy was dealing drugs, so they tarred and feathered him. It's a nice primary source. But here we are at 1765. They're not making any money from this stamp tax. And the non-importation is actually hurting British revenue. So George III agrees and Grenville agrees. They remove the stamp tax. They hated stamp tax. As a way to say thank you, the citizens of New York raise money to erect a lead statue of George III. This is an equestrian statue of King George. And I would like you to remember the statue because we are going to reference it again. So that is all. And good luck on the Ed puzzle. And next time we pick up the story, we will probably be beyond the repeal or the revocation of the stamp tax.